Hello, and welcome to the Oregon Business Matters podcast, brought to you by Oregon Business and Industry, your statewide chamber of commerce. At Oregon Business Matters, we focus on insights, issues, and initiatives that impact Oregonians' shared prosperity and the state's economic health. I'm Angela Wilhelms, President and CEO of OBI, and your host here at Oregon Business Matters. Today, I'm on the sunny side of the state in Bend, where I'm talking with Jon Stark, CEO of Economic Development for Central Oregon, or EDCO for short. EDCO is a nonprofit organization founded in 1981 to strengthen communities by creating family wage jobs. It does so by recruiting employers to Central Oregon, by supporting entrepreneurs, and by helping existing companies grow and expand. These are the things that we love. So today, Jon and I are going to talk about economic development in one of Oregon's fastest growing and, in some ways, more expensive regions. So Jon, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Angela. So excited to be here and appreciate the collaboration both in this effort and our time together throughout the legislative session and our statewide interest to have Oregon be more competitive for business.
Yeah, great. Well, let's get into it. But I want to start with something that you may laugh at. I laugh even going into the question. What is Central Oregon? It's more than Bend. People know that, but help our listeners understand what we're talking about.
You bet. We refer to Central Oregon as the three counties of Crook, Deschutes, and Jefferson County, and the 8 cities within it. All different cities, all different characters, cultures, and feels by each community. We're 250,000 people today. We've grown substantially. We're part of the state that hasn't stopped growing even during the pandemic-related downturn that we had most recently. In fact, we accelerated substantially during that pandemic because people that always wanted to live in Bend and in Central Oregon decided it's time when their employer said, you don't have to show up to work tomorrow, but we need you to work.
Yeah, well, not going to lie, it's nice here. Okay, so now that we have the geography figured out, talk a little bit more about EDCO. Why was the organization formed? How does it pursue its mission? And how do you work through what you were just talking about, economic development in those very different communities?
You bet. Great question. So EDCO was formed in the early 80s, as you'd mentioned earlier, really to create an economy by design instead of by chance. So in the early 80s, you might remember the wood products industry relative to what happened in the housing burst of a bubble really took a huge downturn, and we were sort of held hostage by some great industries in Oregon, the timber industry, and we had primary and secondary wood products in the area. We had a lot of mills here, and that national downturn really just created a loss for Central Oregon in terms of jobs. And so some business leaders came together with our chambers of commerce and our cities, namely in Bend to begin with, but other conversations happened shortly thereafter in Redmond and in other communities to say, what can we do about this? Can we start to bring in some companies that would help diversify our economy so we could weather storms like a downturn? And then, how do we, find ways for those businesses once they get here to accelerate and grow here in Oregon? And so what sort of environment and landscape and table setting do we need to do to make sure that they had adequate workforce, that they had lands that they could expand on, that we had the right infrastructure to help support that? And so really the way we accomplish economic development here is as simple as we help companies move, start, and grow. And that starts with relationships with our business, one CEO at a time, helping remove barriers, solve problems, and helping them accomplish their goals for both trajectory and workforce and growth. But also sometimes it's about just solving a small problem that allows them to stay here. Yeah. And that's the beauty of Central Oregon, is that if it doesn't work for them in one community, we've got 7 other options for them to look at. If it's affordability, we've got another community that has less expensive land. If it's workforce, obviously our primary workforce is here in Bend, but we're within a 15-minute commute to 20-minute commute within 3 other communities. And so we've got options for people. If it doesn't work for one business in one community, we can take a look at another community.
Yeah, one thing you just said in the history that struck me is the timing and the motivation of this. I mean, how prescient of those business leaders in the very early 80s to say, you know what, we really, really excel in these sectors, but maybe we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. And then we all know what happened later in the 80s and into the 90s with the wood products industry in the state. So, you know, I just wanted to comment on how, the foresight that they didn't, that wasn't the intention entirely, but, they were able to probably set you all up for what was going to be an even worse shock to that system.
Well, and we've had the good fortune of the fact that we could start an industry with one company and it could grow here in Oregon and then spin off other industries. So after wood products, we saw aviation aerospace in the later 80s and early 90s with a company called Lance Air that spun off half dozen, as many as a dozen at one time, other aviation companies building general aviation aircraft and a composite skill set in our region that's like no other. More carbon fiber designed airplanes have come out of Central Oregon than anywhere else in the world. We've got Epic aircraft.
The coolest thing made in Oregon a couple of years ago. Epic Aircraft's carbon fiber airplane.
Indeed. So, and then later on it was tech, and now it's bioscience, or life sciences, in the pharmaceutical and medical device world. So we've had these companies have been able to come in and kind of start and grow here, and that's really a testament to the labor force that's here, that is very trainable, very accessible. And while there have been times, just like everywhere else, at 3% unemployment, it's hard to find employees, we still have that in-migration that brings new people and fresh tide in for these folks to lift all boats.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you also mentioned this, so let's go there for a second. The existing businesses. What are you hearing from business owners about operating in Central Oregon, and what's top of mind for them when they knock on your door for some help?
Yeah, again, I think the strengths of why they stay here and why they're able to scale is because it's very difficult for them to leave the labor force that they have here. The civic leadership that's here is really pro-business, and it really works hard to solve those problems for businesses to grow. The climate doesn't hurt, right? It's awfully hard to leave 300 days of sunshine a year and less than 10 inches of rainfall. When we do get a little bit of snow, it usually melts pretty quickly. But the challenge is, I would say, one is that, we're a bit isolated from I-5. So a lot of folks need distribution up and down the I-5 corridor, and we're a ways away from that. And while we have really solid interstate, if you can get to 84 east-west, and 97 presents some options to get folks, but if you need to be in that critical mass of people, the population base of Portland, or you're trying to go through Oregon, that interstate is a challenge for us because we're on a 2-lane highway, and it's not as quick as it is to run down an I-5. Some of the other things, too, we're not next to an international airport. While our airport does provide flights to many international airports, and we're not close to a port. And so while we've talked about some inland port ideas, if you need deep water ports, you're going to be closer to those ports. And so we do have a little bit of isolationism. And then also, we're also impacted by some of the decisions that are made at the state level. Obviously you operate in Central Oregon first, but you also pay taxes statewide. And some of those businesses have talked about some of the issues that they face both in the regulatory environment and the cost of personnel today in Oregon.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, we'll come back to many of those things. Housing, let's talk about housing, because you talked about workforce, and it's no secret housing in Oregon everywhere is expensive. It's very expensive in many parts of Central Oregon as well. So how does that affect business retention or recruitment and workforce availability?
It's been the number one issue with our businesses over the last 5 or 6 years when we really started to see things accelerate. So, our median housing price is just under $800,000 in Bend, but it's also $500,000 in Redmond. So you've got some options 14 miles away if you want to pay anywhere from 30 to 50%. That's been the scale over the last 5 years, the delta between Bend and Redmond. And then if you want to look for something even less than that, the median housing price in Prineville is around $400,000. That's 45 minutes from Bend, though. And so then you create a different problem. You got a transportation issue. So that's how we've been able to combat it, is there are choices at a lower price in other communities. But still, I never thought I would be in a market that my house was worth over $500,000. And we used to be anywhere from 10 to 20% less than Portland. Now we exceed Portland. And some of that's, a challenge that starts at the grassroots level. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, I'm sure. But, our land use system isn't necessarily performing the way that it was in the 70s for us. And so there's some opportunity there. But one of the things that I would say is our communities have been transformative in addressing this. Bend has been able to create a number of affordable housing strategies here in the area to help combat this. They've got deed restricted housing. They've used state pilots to get some things done here. Redmond's done a bit of the same. And I think if you drive around, I think we have more multifamily housing going on than anywhere else in the state. So they're definitely focused on workforce housing today, and they put a pretty sizable dent in the demand side of that. It's still not enough.
That's kudos to the community here for coming together to actually, focus on the problem, identify some solutions, and starting to chip away at those, because you do see the building happening. Well, let's, you went there, and so I want to come back to some of the positive momentum and things that you are working on proactively. But let's take a minute and talk about some of the state level things that affect you. That's what we do. That's where you and I intersect in our work to make Oregon more competitive. You talked about land use, so let's start there. What's top of mind when you think about the land use system?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we built that system in 1973, and we have a set of priorities today that, protect farmland and forest land. Everybody wants to make sure we can eat, right? Agriculture is important. In fact, Jefferson County's GDP growth is largely tied to agriculture, and that's an important heritage. And we got to be able to feed our people as well. But we aren't farming as much as we used to. We have a scarcity of water, and we've protected an awful lot of land such that, we haven't annexed in. Cities have not been able to keep up, particularly in Bend. We're kind of at the epicenter of that happening. And so some reform to modernize that system, back in the 70s and 80s, forestry and farming as part of a GDP, those were top 5 industries. Those aren't even top 25 industries today. They're 23 and 24. And so today there are other industries propelling our GDP, and we've got to do something to, one, think about the affordability of our housing with some long-range planning strategies, and then just remove some barriers while still protecting farming and forest land, because we all want open space, and that's part of the reason we love Oregon. And so how do we come together with those folks that are really interested in protecting farm and forest land, with those that see a tremendous economic opportunity to resolve some of the issues?
Yeah, no, well, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is we got to come together and have the conversation.
No doubt.
We can't all just sit in our own corners and think about what we'd like to see and recognize that there are these potential conflicts. Somebody's got to set a table we can all sit around it and work on it. What else is top of mind? We talked about housing, we talked about land use. We won't belabor this, but let's pick one or two other state issues that are top of mind for you.
Yeah. So as we've talked to businesses on the regular, an ability to be profitable, right? We've continued to add layers of regulation around the cost of personnel. And while we, passed a minimum wage requirement, it's not about the minimum wage. It's about the next level up. So anytime the minimum wage goes up, all of those employers have to increase their floor for their employers. And so we've artificially given people raises, and we get it. We're trying to combat the cost of living, but we're also creating a higher cost of living because we're creating inflation through that. And, I'm a big supporter of paying people adequate wages, and Oregon does a pretty good job of that, competitively speaking. And some of our communities are paying a much higher wage today because of some technology investments. But at the end of the day, how does that affect a business's profitability? The other one is paid leave Oregon, if I'm to be honest. I have employers that have 45 people working on the production floor, and where they're carrying 7 to 10% more employees on that production floor just for paid leave Oregon, so they can have people there to work while people are out on paid leave. The challenge with that is, these are corporations that have a fixed labor cost. I can only pay this amount of money for these laborers to produce this amount of product. Well, that means that they're going to carry more people, but they're not paying them more. They're actually paying them less. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, and I think there's some opportunity this year. I know the state legislature has talked about maybe some reform in this place, and so we're eager to get to work in that space. And the last one, honestly, is the commercial activities tax. That is probably the number one barrier that I hear for businesses. So if we got to create a workable solution, how do we increase that threshold so it doesn't affect as many small businesses? But we knew going in that was going to change the landscape from a competitive perspective. We had the Tax Foundation come in and analyze this thing for us ahead of schedule, and we knew it was going to take us to pretty far down on the competitiveness list at the bottom 5. And somehow, the governor's got this prosperity plan, and in it is to move up the CNBC's index. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Let's get in the top 10.
Yeah, we the CAT is something we talk about a lot. So we're there with you, and whether it's the threshold because there's no indexing and it strikes very low. Low revenue, gross revenue for businesses to be able to have to pay that tax, whether it's the compounding effect that any gross receipts tax is going to have as it works its way through the supply chain, ultimately to consumers. All of those things need to be looked at. Between the CAT and then you mentioned Paid Leave Oregon, so that insurance program, both of which were passed by the legislature in 2019. We did a study a few years ago, and from 2019 to 2024, the effective business tax burden, or the effective business tax rate in Oregon, increased by a full third, 33%, as those two came online. I mean, that's an extraordinary leap in cost. And as you pointed out, whenever you're raising costs and eroding profitability, you are actually also eroding the ability to invest in workers through higher wages or more benefits. You're eroding R&D, innovation that maybe gets us to cleaner technology faster or, whatnot. So it's really been this problematic cycle that's unfolded. And you see it not just in our tax rankings from the Tax Foundation, but overall business competitiveness. So we hear you.
Well, and I think too, sometimes we don't get to see some of these decisions that businesses make. We hear about the ones that are leaving, but what are the investments that we're missing? We're in a 2-tax state. We have income tax and we have property tax. That means we have to create jobs and we have to create capital investment. And so, when a business that has multiple locations across the country looks at a spreadsheet for where it's going to make an investment of, call it $20 million. That $20 million goes, to your point, 33% less far in Oregon than it does in one of these other columns on the spreadsheet. And I remember when we passed minimum wage, some of my corporate companies would talk about, the fact that, that was a yellow blip, and then it was orange, and then it was kind of red. And so we may not see that investment come here. And so I'll close with this. This is a great place to operate a business. We still have some really good things going for us. We are still competitive in a lot of different ways. Our labor force is strong. But what I would want to say to those folks when they think about, trying to create some reform is, we can't tax our way to prosperity. That's not my term. That's been used by, people in leadership positions clear back into World War II. These are the folks that are going to dig us out of a recession. So we got to find ways to allow them to be profitable, particularly those that are, on thin margins.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of some of those companies, and you talked about some of the industries that are growing and coming and staying here in Central Oregon, but it seems like EDCO has very deliberately focused on traded sector employers in a handful of clusters. So can you talk about those a little more and tell our listeners a little bit about the value of those traded sector businesses and why you chose those clusters and how they're doing in the region?
Yeah, so it's always started with a founder that got something started that we saw an ability to scale it, and then how do we spin that off and repeat rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And one of the things that I found unique to Central Oregon, I haven't seen in other areas, is founders are willing to help founders here in a way that's just amazing. We had a pub talk the other night for the outdoor industry, and we had founders of companies like Hydro Flask in the audience, and numerous others, and they're there helping other companies. The founder of Ben Research, that's now Lonza after several acquisitions, is still an adjunct professor at OSU teaching work in energy and life sciences, and he's helping mentor companies here. So, we focus on 5 industries. We focus on advanced manufacturing, which is building products, advanced metallurgical type companies, and aviation aerospace. Life sciences, which is medical device, pharmaceutical, and nutraceutical companies. Technology, which is both hardware, software, and data centers. We also focus on headquarter operations or administrative centers. It includes call centers. And then lifestyle products. And we've kind of looped all that in because we're a lifestyle area to brewing and distilling and non-alcoholic beverage and food products and outdoor.
Yeah.
And
okay.
all of those industries have a critical mass here. And so we've partnered with other organizations to help find ways to remove barriers for them to grow and continue to build out infrastructure for that to happen, either through the Central Oregon Innovation Hub or our partnerships with a business accelerator called BOW or Cultivate Bend. And so there's a tribe of people working on taking these industry clusters to the next level. And I think it's what's unique is that people aren't necessarily leaving, but they're staying to help the next guy.
Yeah, that is terrific to hear. That's a great ecosystem,
no doubt,
to have. It's terrific. I mean, that's how we keep it growing. So that's great to hear. Okay, you mentioned data centers.
Yes.
I am in Central. We cannot have a conversation about the economy in Central Oregon without talking about data centers. There's a lot of talk about them in the news. So I won't go on my soapbox. I'm here to interview you, but there's debate, and Central Oregon in many ways was one of the first places to see a lot of this activity. My understanding, just as an anecdote here, is that Meta, for example, Meta Platforms, that data center in Prineville, has 600 employees working in Prineville. So a lot of things we hear are, there aren't any workers there, but there are 600 employees there, and it's the 9th largest employer in the region. The other thing I think that's interesting, okay, I said I wasn't going to on my soapbox, but here I go. The other thing I think is interesting is we toured BaseX in Redmond as part of our Manufacturing and Innovation Roadshow a few years ago. Thanks to your help, we got connected with them. And that's a growing company with more than 1,000 employees in Redmond that was born out of the data center world, if you will. They make the HVAC systems for data centers. So I guess I just mentioned this because I think there's so much misinformation and missing information in the conversation. It doesn't mean there aren't hard things to unpack about land and energy and all that, but I think it's so much more complicated, and you guys have been in it way longer than most of us. So react.
Yeah. So let me talk about the impact, right? So first, we are the consumers of the data in those buildings. Yes, we have large corporations meeting a market opportunity. You bet. It's expensive business. But our phones have gotten smaller. That data has to go somewhere. We use an awful lot of social media today. That data has to go somewhere. The pictures on our phone, those can't be stored in a phone for very long. They have to be uploaded to the cloud. The cloud actually lives somewhere, right? And so we're the consumers of that data. But let me just talk a little bit about the impact. So we started an effort with a small community that wanted to change the landscape from wood products, as I kind of stated earlier. They wanted to find ways to do economic development in a new way. And they knew that they thought, boy, we could sure look at technology to help advance some of our economic development goals. While they could land some employers here and there of 30 and 40 employees in advanced manufacturing, there was no real game changer. Lockheed Martin's not moving to Prineville, Oregon. They got to have a critical mass of labor force. But a data center could. Why? Well, the climate, because it's cool air nights here. Even in 100-degree weather, we're getting down to 60 degrees, and that cold air can be stored. So the data centers were particularly interested in that. Two, the power cost in Oregon is half of California, right, per kilowatt hour. And there's misnomers out there that are going to come in and suck up all our energy. Yes, they use energy, but we all are consuming energy. Walk around your house and look at what you plug into your house today versus what you plugged into your house 10 years ago. And I'm including cars and iPhones, and we don't have a gas weed eater anymore. And so we are all consuming more energy. The data centers are consuming some energy, but it doesn't mean your power rates are going to go up. They have to pay their fair share for system upgrades, and they have to pay their fair share for energy. And the utilities want to serve it. Water's the same thing. We've gotten so much better with our technology today. They're able to reclaim so much water with the modernized swamp coolers and storing that energy at night. And so, yeah, they use a little bit of water, but not substantial amounts of water. And older technology, different story. But what's coming in today is lower. They use some larger buildings and some land. But let's talk about impact. So in 2008 or so, going into the Great Recession, Crook County's unemployment rate was almost 20%. Today it's 5.6%. 2011, before the first building went up, Prineville is 20th in terms of average wage by county of all 36 counties. Today they're number 2. They're $18,000 ahead of the state average.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's impact. Plus, their GDP growth is 7 times Oregon's GDP growth at 74% over the last 5 years. So impact, 600 jobs, but we're not counting the induced jobs, the indirect jobs.
That's true.
So almost 1-to-1 for every employee that's working, the 600 at these 12 buildings, there's another 400 or 500 people that are going in servicing that. And then you look at the supply chain. You mentioned that earlier. The supply chain that's been built up in the industrial park around these data centers, and there's 2. There's a small fruit company and technology that's up in Prineville, and then we have the Meta data center. And those help lift the wages. Those folks are good community stewards. They've contributed to curriculum in the schools. They've helped lift the tax rate because those incentives, which a lot of data centers aren't using anymore just because they don't want that image, but those that have those things hit the tax rolls this next year. And so they've helped lift the tax base. They've donated money to the schools through grants. They've offered iPads to almost every student in Crook County. And they've helped increase the wages. Like they're 26% higher than the state average. How do you take a small rural town that might be able to get some base hits at 40 jobs here, 40 jobs there, and completely change the landscape with an investment in one industry? That's how you do it.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that. I mean, obviously all communities aren't created equal, but I think it's really important for people to understand that the sort of assumed vilification maybe warrants a little more homework. And again, they're complicated conversations to unpack on a lot of fronts, but I think it's important to stay rooted in who the customers are, the consumers of that product are, and the overall picture that we're painting.
Yeah, I agree. I think at the end of the day, for us, for data centers, it's part of an economic development strategy for diversification, and you can still be, selective about who you want to partner with. Central Oregon doesn't want to become the data center of all of the Pacific Northwest, but some strategic investments here and there make sense, particularly in what we've seen in some of these communities.
Well, not just who you partner with, but how you partner with them and what you expect out of that partnership.
Precisely.
Because it is a partnership, and we say it all the time. Incentives should be rooted in the basic principle of ROI, a return on investment. And that's what you're talking about here. I think giveaways for the sake of giveaways aren't good for anybody.
Precisely.
But if we can find some real ROI in a collaborative partnership that works for the community, we'd be fools to just kind of walk away whole hog.
That's right. If we want to participate in an economic opportunity in a thoughtful way, then we've got to have some tools to help make those possible for all industries.
Yeah. Okay. So you are obviously a very forward-thinking person. That's where you live. You're constantly looking ahead. trying to solve problems, trying to plan for the future, trying to help these communities and companies plan for the future. So where do you see it? Where do you see Central Oregon's economy going?
Yeah, we are really fortunate to have the desirability of Central Oregon because our CEOs want to be here too. They like the lifestyle. They like the ability to attract a labor force here. We have a solid pipeline of opportunity, companies that have talked to us about their next expansion over the next 3 years. And so this next 3 years actually looks better than the last 3 years. And that's a pretty good position to be, considering that we've seen the state of Oregon's job creation flatten out a little bit, and our trajectory is down a bit too. But at least in the traded sector, and that's where we focus. Those are companies that export products and bring in new wealth to our region. We see a lot of promise in our pipeline. My concern is that these companies, when we have a company come tell us they want to do something, it takes 2 to 7 years for that to materialize. And honestly, since the pandemic, what was 2 years now takes 3 years, because of some of the things we've talked about earlier, whether it be land use or regulatory, and so, or the cost of capital or the cost of materials. So we have a good pipeline. The next 3 years looks good. I'm concerned about 4 and 5 and 6 years. If we don't start to change some of the reputation of Oregon, to start becoming again a state that is ready to see economic development happen, and we're creating new vehicles for them to land here, whether it be, recoupling with the federal code on qualified business stock, or recoupling with the bonus depreciation to allow employers to maximize their investments here. I'm concerned about being able to refill that. And so while that trajectory looks promising, at least in our lens, what's happening after 3 years is where I'm concerned. Unless we start turning this, this state a little bit around and making some turns here, and some of the work that we've collectively done and some of the things I've mentioned, I fear for what that future holds. Still, we keep working at it and grinding away and talking to employers, and luckily we have companies making large investments here that show promise for the future. I just need to have that next set of companies in that pipeline once they complete their projects.
Yeah, and we can't take for granted all those historical advantages, including the ones here. We gotta do the work to position ourselves in a hyper competitive landscape. We could have started with this, but I'm gonna make this sort of my closing question. We've talked a lot about economic development and economic growth, and helping the private sector succeed once it's here. Move, grow, stay. But why is a healthy private sector in Central Oregon so important? Why should the community care about the work you're doing to support and boost the business community?
Well, I'm going to go way down to grassroots level, right? So in an economy, you have consumers and you have producers. Consumers of wealth and producers of wealth. And the way we designed our tax system, we have to have producers of wealth. And, government is not a producer of wealth. They're a producer of services, but they consume wealth. These businesses, these private sector businesses that create property taxes and income tax and pay other taxes along the way and fees, those are the folks of the engine of our economy. The other sector I didn't mention is tourism, people coming to our state.
Of course, yeah.
And visiting here is traded sector as well. But at the end of the day, we have to have more producers than we have consumers. And the more we tax the producers, the more we're spending that money on consumers. And so we have to have balance, and we have to have an engine that can thrive and can propel our economy into the next level. If you go back and you look at states that are winning this space, right? They've cleared the runway, so to speak, so these planes can take off and carry the economy with them. And so that's why we're focused on the traded sector. While we do have, in our smaller communities, some of our local people might help recruit a grocery store because they don't have that critical mass of traded sector. And until they do, they're helping out in different areas. But we spend our limited resources really focused on the place we can make the most difference. And that is helping a traded sector company, one CEO at a time, either start a new enterprise or grow the one that's here or bring somebody new in. And I really feel like, we have a tremendous opportunity, for the collective work that we do here, having a conversation, and again with the governor, creating this prosperity council. There's some light at the end of the tunnel. We're starting to have some real conversations about some things and some change that is needed for us to climb our way out of what we've sort of sown in our own bed here.
Yeah. Well said. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, although you and I could talk all
Ad-lib
day.
forever.
We could go
For
on
sure.
and on.
Riff and riff.
No one wants that. But is there anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Just to say, I appreciate the opportunity. Our state's a great state. We do have an industrial critical mass here that has done a really nice job of helping propel our economy over the last 20 years. And I'm just working to maintain it, and appreciate all the work that OBI does with businesses as well, and look forward to our mutual collaboration going forward, and hopefully we can influence some change.
Yeah, likewise. Well, thank you, Jon Stark, the CEO of Economic Development for Central Oregon, or EDCO, for joining me today. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. The Oregon Business Matters podcast is a production of OBI, your statewide chamber. And we put all of our episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. So Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Please follow, subscribe, and share. For more information about EDCO, you can visit
www.edcoinfo.com.
Okay. And for more information about OBI, visit OregonBusinessIndustry.com. Thank you very much.